Hi, and welcome to another conversation on the Forward 50 YouTube channel, this time with Olivia Neal. Olivia is the Director of Digital Transformation for the worldwide public sector at Microsoft. And before that, has a long history in digital government, both in the UK and in Canada. Hi, Olivia. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm great, Alistair. Thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you here. And you're one of the few people I can say that we spoke to about Forward 50 before it was a thing. We first met in the UK before you'd even come to Canada. And I remember going to Canada House and pubs
hmm
there. It's been quite an arc.
It has. Yeah, I remember. I think we had a sort of semi-official meeting at Canada House, and then a less official meeting in a pub on Trafalgar Square. But between those two things, yeah, it's been quite a journey, and it's been really fantastic to see how Forward 50 has developed over the last 3 years as well. I mean, it's just amazing now to have that many countries all coming to Ottawa, whether that be virtually or hopefully next year in real life. I think it's really helped put Ottawa on the map. So I think both from the perspective of when I was in government and now from being outside of government and wanting to keep driving those conversations, I think we're so grateful for the role that Forward 50 have been playing in that.
Well, one of the nice things about being the sort of blunt instrument that can ask pointed questions is a useful function. And one of the things that came up this year with Minister Murray, I kind of challenged the public sector to say that you're actually all working for a big tech firm. You just haven't realized it yet. Do you think that's true? Is government a big tech firm?
So I think that's a really interesting and challenging statement, which is perfect because it makes people think. So I think there is a lot of truth in that, but I wouldn't be surprised if that makes people quite nervous because I think a lot of people's preconceptions around what big tech is are not always the most positive of preconceptions. Particularly, we hear a lot of things in the news which make us very suspicious of that. So I think there is something to be thought about in terms of what is the role of government in terms of understanding the needs of its users, meeting the needs of those users, whether they be citizens or businesses, running effectively internal operations, which are the same types of operations as lots of other companies, whether they be tech or manufacturing or retail, have as well. So all of those kind of back-end finance and HR operations, they're really things that government are running as well. So government has these functions of service, of delivery, of operations, and it also has this responsibility of policy making and affecting outcomes on a really, really large scale. And I think the way that government is starting to adapt is to start to look at those with different approaches. Governments around the world are starting to think about how do we bring in the perspectives of our users, not just as we're developing our public facing services, but also as we're developing our legislation and our policy as well. And I think those approaches that tech firms take around using agile approaches, being iterative, being user centered, those starting to come into government are really starting to challenge and change some of the ways that government operates. I mean, obviously, when we think about tech companies, of course, we have to make money. We have to keep our profit motive going. But actually, from my perspective, there's a lot more to what certainly what we do at Microsoft than just that profit side, which I think is really interesting as a parallel to government. So, for example, when I joined Microsoft, and I put a lot of thought into, leaving government. That was a huge decision for me. I'd spent my entire career either in the UK government or in the Canadian government, and so it was a big decision for me to leave and move to the private sector. But when I researched Microsoft, when I learned about what Microsoft does, actually, one of the things that I think is not necessarily really obvious is that we have a huge, what is essentially policy making decision. So Microsoft thinks and acts very deeply on things like sustainability, on racial injustice, on privacy, on accessibility. And we're really using the way that we operate and the way that we think about and invest our money to drive outcomes in that space. And sustainability is one of the things that we talked about at Forward 50 and we ran a workshop on, because I think there's so many pieces there which, as an ecosystem, both public and private sector, have to come together to really push and drive forward.
Yeah, and there's so many things that I had the opportunity to speak with Deborah Harrison, who works on the Cortana team for a conference I was running with Georgian, and some of the stories she told us about just getting the narrative right in Cortana. How do you make sure that if someone says something offensive, how do you respond to sort of diffuse that in a conversational chatbot? It becomes almost philosophy. And I
Mm.
think that's the thing people haven't realized is there's a huge difference between private sector tech and public sector tech. As you said, private sector has a profit motive, so it's going to target lucrative markets where there's a lot of users with homogeneous needs. In the public sector, you're often targeting the margins, and this is something that came up in one of the forward thinking episodes we did with Ayushi Roy and Catherine Benjamin and Kathy Pham. Was you're designing for the margins, and then the middle will follow in the public sector, whereas in the private sector, you tend to design for the lucrative centralized markets. But it does seem like, and we used a couple of Microsoft's features, the PowerPoint, when you drag images in, it'll tag the image with alt text, right, to make it more accessible. Or you can turn on captioning. And in some of our speaker training, I showed people the turning on of closed captioning and live translation. Nobody knew about it. And I mean, we live in Canada. By law, things should be bilingual. And if that's a button, then it's inexcusable not to use it. So it seems to me like there's a lot of room for the public sector to catch up with what's possible in the private sector, just to become like just the table stakes of what we're supposed to do.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting, because I think that when we think about this ecosystem of how can we deliver better, how can governments deliver better, both in terms of operations and services that are facing the public, if our role, a part of our role as a large tech company, as Microsoft's role in that large ecosystem, is to really build for everybody and to start to bring some of what have been seen as edge cases before, so those accessibility requirements, the language requirements, and make them part of the norm. So if what we do can mainstream that and make that easy for government to pick up and adopt, then we can help governments achieve their missions and drive those ambitions. And at Microsoft, our mission is to help every person and organization on the planet to achieve more. So we're really thinking, okay, globally, how do we use that influence and that ability that we have through our products and through our research to drive those types of things? And I think that example of translation is so fascinating, and it's one that, having spent time in the Canadian government, obviously is top of mind. But when we think about that in other countries around the world, there's a really interesting case where the EU Parliament at the moment are looking at how can they augment the capabilities of their human translators by bringing digital approaches into that mix. So in the EU Parliament, there are 24 official languages, and they have translators who will do real-time translation for people there, which is voice, but they don't have real-time translation and transcription. So what they're looking at trying to get to is, how can we have our viewers who are maybe hard of hearing or watching in a second language, or both of those things, able to engage in the discussions of the EU Parliament in whatever language they choose. So that is a hugely complex web of translation that has to happen there. It's in a situation where you've got loads of technical jargon, loads of parliamentary phrases, and you've got people who are speaking in regional accents. They're sometimes speaking in their own second language. So there's this really interesting process going on at the moment where the EU Parliament have got a procurement out, and it's just, if you're interested in procurement and government, it's quite interesting because it's a slightly not, right? Which of course that we are. It's a slightly non-traditional approach where they've said, okay, we want 3 firms to bid for this first. So Microsoft, or they want as many firms as possible, that they selected 3. Microsoft are one of those 3. So we're working to, by September next year, have a service which does that translation, simultaneous translation to transcription for 10 languages. And then at that point next year, the European Parliament are going to judge which of those 3 solutions they take forward and do all of the 24. But I mean, that use of AI and machine learning based on those huge amounts of records that the European Parliament have is such an interesting use. And then you can see how that use case could be extrapolated and used by businesses or used by other organizations all around the world to just try and bring more people in and make those types of discussions more inclusive.
Well, and transcription, I had a conversation with David Best, who is an advocate for people who have trouble seeing things and would like other approaches to that. And I learned a ton of stuff about even things I took for granted. For example, if you're filling out a form and the form has a field that says, your email is required. So if I type my email address and I type the letter A, they get a message saying must be a valid email address. And I type C, must be a valid email address. What I didn't realize is that in most cases of code, that's actually rewriting the web page. And so the reader rereads the entire form, every character you type. And so we basically took away the mandatory field so we didn't get that pop-up message. But these are things that we're not aware of. But one of the things that was obvious to me is that we used to think of assistive devices that are doing transcription as a crutch, as a way of helping someone with a disability or with an inability to consume the content. Nowadays, we just watch things on our phone. right? Like we're scrolling, we don't have the
Mm,
volume on, or we're in the car and we would
mm.
like Siri or Cortana or Google or whatever to be able to read to us a page and interpret it. And so you no longer have, you know, 25 million people who need this. You have 2.5 billion people who need this. And so accessibility actually becomes not just accessibility for humans, but accessibility for machines that can then turn that into useful corpus for making services better. And so I think the way we think about these things is no longer we're helping some people, it's we're enabling new ways of working.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I think that's, that ability to build in those types of capabilities is such an important part of what we think about. And Microsoft's been on a real journey with accessibility. And, it's such a fundamentally important part for us now. And if Satya Nadella, who's our CEO, talks a lot about this space and the personal importance of it to him, which is really fascinating. And then I think we think about, not just those types of accessibility, but now we're thinking a lot about areas like responsible AI, which of course is something which the Canadian government have really been driving and pushing and really seen as world leaders in. But from our perspective within Microsoft, there is a lot of really deep thinking. We have great responsible AI experts. We have our own principles. We have our own committee. And what that does is really look at the work and the products and the solutions that we're developing and saying, how are we sure that all of those are meeting our responsible AI principles? And
Well,
then
you
I
have an
think,
exclusive license for GPT-3 too,
okay,
right?
see, it is.
Because you supported OpenAI, and so I was joking the other day that which is always a dangerous thing, that we're used to the words copy and paste. Everyone knows what they do, right? We're used to undo. These are common functions that have entered the vernacular of anybody who uses digital tools. I'm waiting for a button called go. And already you're starting to see suggested text in your phone when you type something and it auto
Yeah.
completes a sentence, or in PowerPoint you're seeing suggested slide layouts. But at what point will I write a paragraph of text that is a prompt and then hit go? And there are uses where, I mean, if there are certain words that are very problematic in the corpus, but if
Yeah.
I'm a teacher and I want to make a quiz, I can make a quiz very, very quickly with the answers using GPT-3 based on the readings, and now I have a quiz for my kids, right? And so this to me is how we start this human machine chimera sort of. We're and what's interesting but also terrifying about it is that when we let the computer put words at our fingertips, we are now taking sort of the sum of all human knowledge, which has been gathered into a corpus like GPT-3, and then we are giving people a tool that, with a click of a button, will start writing on their behalf. Consequences for plagiarism, consequences for marginalization,
Mm,
consequences for the fact that it's a model that was trained on the past, so it doesn't have new information.
mm.
You need to think very deeply about this stuff, like at a sort of philosophical level. And I think it's great to see that organizations like OpenAI are trying to make sure this stuff isn't in the hands of the few.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of really important points there. So that responsible AI approaches and those principles and those really embedding those in how we're developing and what we use things for, both from the companies that are developing things and from governments who are putting them into practice, is that such an important place for us to come together. But then there's also this part around how do we help people feel comfortable having those conversations and making those decisions and understanding where to use technologies and where to put extra checks and balances in place. And I think one of the things that I'm really conscious of when I'm talking to civil servants and having been one is that actually this is just quite confusing, quite unsettling, and quite difficult for a lot of people. And lots of civil service organizations around the world in all countries have models which are based on really a preference for people who have come up through policy making positions.
Right.
And often, by those people, time those people get into leadership positions, they will have done something operational. They will have run tax offices or borders or call centers. But we haven't really asked much of public servants in the past to really start learning and understanding about technology. So I think that there's this really interesting question for governments and other organizations as well, but to think about how do we skill our people properly. And that goes from both, people who have in the past been running physical data centers and we're now expecting to run cloud services, to those people who are in leadership positions. And I think particularly sometimes when you're in a leadership position, it's quite hard to say, I actually don't know this. I don't know what you're talking about. Or, you
Well, and I
sometimes
think
even
because people want a policy, they want you to be decisive as a leader. Tell me
yeah,
what to do. And if you don't know, the only decisive action you can take is to not act, which
yeah.
reinforces that whole issue of excessive caution and government being too deliberative and not being fast paced enough, right?
Yeah, and I think it's really tricky, and I have a lot of sympathy for people who are in those types of positions because we haven't asked this of them in the past, and we've asked them to be very good at understanding legal ramifications or understanding a balance sheet. We haven't helped them get to the stage where they understand technology. And when you go into a conversation where it's full of people who say, "Oh, I've been working in tech for the last 20 years," or "I've been doing digital stuff for the last 10 years," that can be very intimidating to someone outside that space. So I think really helping people get up to speed on those types of conversations is important. And that's where, things like digital academies, which the Canadian Public Service has set up, the UK Public Service has set up, are really important. And then there's also a lot of training that's available to people who aren't sure about this stuff, which they can do in their own time. So there's lots of options out there. But for example, we have an AI business school for leaders, which we worked with INSEAD on, and it's designed for those kind of senior leaders to help you understand, what is this technology? How can I use it? What's the governance I should put around it? So there's all these resources that are out there for people. But I think it's really incumbent both on governments to think about how they upskill people, but also on an individual civil servants, think about, how am I going to get myself ready for the future? Because, in the end of the day, we're all responsible for our own careers.
So, I mean, it seems like there's varying degrees of maturity that you've seen across different governments and different departments. How should we think about this evolution from, policy first, technology is just how it gets done, and I don't really have to worry about that, to one in which the leader is thinking about digital first? What's that
Yeah.
maturity look like?
So I think that's something we've been thinking quite a lot about, and one of the interesting things about Microsoft is that obviously we work in pretty much every country around the world, so we get this really interesting insight into what's going on. And I, from within government, had personally been working with a good number of countries, but not anywhere near this scale. So I think what we're seeing is, when we're thinking about that evolution of digital governments, is really kind of four key stages supported by a set of enablers. And I think these will sound really familiar to you. So we're starting to see governments who are still in this kind of traditional government phase, in this analog phase. And I've heard you use the word analog a lot to describe this type of government, but this is where, frankly, most governments still have elements of their approaches where they're based on paper, where it's in-person verification. Maybe there's a fax machine requirement thrown in there somewhere, but really it's about single teams, single services, single delivery, no data sharing, really that very siloed model based on paper-based processes. And then I think what tends to happen is that next stage, is the second stage, is this move into what I would call a transactional government, where people in governments with the best of intentions are saying, okay, we need to make more stuff available online. And that's what I think in the past we've kind of talked about as e-government, where we're digitizing rather than making digital. So you're getting information online, forms online, but it's not any real fundamental change the way that government operates. So you still see the same siloed teams, the same siloed data, but just with this kind of veneer of digital on top, which is just, a website. Then through to where I think we're seeing a lot of those leading governments at the moment in a third stage, which I think is really around being a service-centered government. So when we think about the governments that are top of that kind of UN pile, there's South Korea, there's Denmark, who are really thinking about those life journeys. How do we focus what we do on the life events of citizens? So really mapping out and bringing those pieces together. And it sounds so straightforward when you're outside government. It's so difficult when you're inside government to make that happen. And particularly when you think about trying to do this across levels of government. So for example, when you start a job, when you retire, when you have a baby, really bringing those pieces together. And I think that's where we've seen a lot of push. But then I think there is this fourth stage, which we're thinking of as being like that really intelligent government phase. So taking the lessons that you've learned through that service center stage and saying, how do we expand on those? How do we apply that not just to the public facing services we do, but to everything else that we do in government as well? How do we better share data to inform policy, to inform trade negotiations, to manage our grants, to manage our internal finances? So those are the kind of stages that we're seeing. But I think that what's important for me is that the underpinning pieces of that journey are kind of threefold. So I would say you've got a tech layer to that. Obviously, you've got to improve your technical capabilities, your digital capabilities together. But then for government, I think you've also got two other layers. One being people and culture. So how have you got the right people? How have you got the right skills? How have you got the right leadership to drive this change? And then also governance and rules. And I think probably nowhere is this more obvious and important than within the government sphere, because when we're talking about the governance, often we are really looking at actual legislation as well. So how do we start now thinking about the legislation? And there's countries like Denmark, actually, who have got some really interesting pieces in this space. So Denmark have this approach for something called digital ready legislation. So
yeah, I was just going to say this has come up in talking to Paul Glover and others over the last few months. Jessamine talked about anticipatory service delivery, where the government anticipates what you want. And one of the big differences here, if you go and file an insurance claim in the private sector, the insurer wants to minimize their payouts. So they're trying to find ways to disqualify or whatever. Whereas if a single mother shows up at Service Canada and says, hey, I need food stamps, they should be offered child support, other assistance, whatever. They should be offered a whole series of things, because the government is trying to give away its services as opposed to trying to restrict access to its services. It's turning supply and demand on its head. But the extension of all that is to anticipate something. So the person doesn't even have to come in asking for something. And her point in eliminating paper forms was that a paper form is by definition an application, me asking you.
Yeah.
And government needs to design for interruption rather than design for requests, right? So it's saying, I'm going to interrupt you with this thing. And in order to interrupt you with good context, I need more information about your life than many citizens are willing to divulge. So this idea that you can be anticipatory and say, I think you're about to have a baby. That's creepy, right? Like we saw Target do that and people said, how dare you tell me that?
Yeah.
But at the same time, if you voluntarily, like the UK has this thing where you sign up and say I'm having a kid, and each day you get a text saying what to expect this week, which is anticipatory. And so I think policy and legislation has to be written in a way that can be implemented. We don't write we write legislation so it's readable in English and in Canada French. We don't write it so it's readable in PHP or Python.
Yeah.
Right? And I like that idea of, if, as you say, the digital leaders become more literate in the public sector, they will start to craft legislation that can be turned into code.
Yeah, and I think that's such a fascinating conversation, and one that is a deep, long conversation. And it's so great to see things like that now being taken by organizations like the OECD, who are publishing papers on that, and like that starting to become a mainstream conversation is so exciting. But I think that anticipatory place and how can you better engage with what people need is really interesting, because I think there's elements of that which are on a personal level, but then there's also bigger picture elements of that as well. So if you are responsible for running a country as a whole, and you can understand maybe where you're seeing shops and pubs having lower takings in a certain area, and maybe that's an indicator of less disposable income, maybe it's an indicator of more support needed in terms of job finding, more support needed in terms of benefits. How can things be joined up on that kind of bigger country picture to really bring data together to proactively target support? And I think what we saw in COVID, of course, is some of those things actually starting to happen in terms of getting PPE to certain areas, or in the UK, we saw certain councils bringing together different data sets so that they could understand who the most vulnerable members of communities were and get volunteers out to them.
I mean, if you see someone applying for a liquor license and you say, just so you know, the last 5 businesses at that address all applied for liquor licenses, they were all restaurants, they all failed. Are you sure you want this license? Like, there are ways we can, the act of applying for a license should trigger, here's what the government, which is owned by you, can tell you about the kind of business you're about to start. Here's the publicly available data. As a small business owner, when you apply for a business license, don't just give them the license back. Say, here's the intelligence contextual to you that will help you be a more productive, competitive citizen. I don't think anyone's going to object to that. I've got a long list of things I've been typing away that I want to talk to you about, and we only have a few minutes. First of all, let's talk about the difference between efficiency and effectiveness. So much of the discussions we see are like, is this efficient? And we don't have a good way of measuring the effectiveness of a law. And oftentimes when people say, well, you got to be transparent and accountable, but when you attach accountability metrics, they tend to drive efficiency. It's much harder to drive effectiveness. This came up, I think we've had a number of people talk about the challenges with, I was talking to Kate O'Riordan, who's the CIO of the Financial Times a few weeks ago. And she said that they would track engagement as a metric of success for subscribers. She said, but engagement's a terrible proxy. What I actually care about is, did I make my readers' lives better? Right? Did I improve their business standing as a subscriber? And the proxy for that is, well, they read the newspaper a lot. But that could be that they got fired and they had time to read newspaper, or maybe they're on the support page, right? How do, in your experience in government, how do we measure effectiveness, not just efficiency, when we're trying to be more transparent and accountable?
So I think it's a great question, and I think there's a couple of pieces to that. And I guess my overarching answer is, I'm not sure anyone's doing that particularly brilliantly at the moment. But one of the things when I was in the UK that we really pushed on was measures on effectiveness of digital services. And I don't think these are perfect, but they're a start. So we mandated that all new digital services had to display KPIs relating to their effectiveness. And those were user satisfaction. So at the end of completing a digital service, somebody got a very straightforward, quick and easy to answer, just effective satisfaction survey. And it was just one question. So that was one measure. One measure was the cost per transaction, which was an important internal measure, and a kind of an important piece of evidence for us in kind of putting more resources into some of that digital agenda. But I think one of the really important ones was completion rate. So measuring end to end, could somebody get through that journey that they were trying to do without going away and then coming back first time unaided? And that is like, when you are taking what has been a really complex 49-page PDF form and putting that into a simple, straightforward, easy to use service, that is incredibly valuable if you can get somebody to that stage and you're stopping wasting their time, and you are making that the delivery of that service much more both efficient and effective for them. But I think it is an area where we don't have a lot of evidence. We don't talk a lot about those kind of wider benefits of measuring digital transformation, which aren't just around efficiency. And I think that's an area where there's more research, which is going to be really interesting. And I think that there are opportunities. And I think, we tend to talk a lot about services when we're talking about digital transformation, because it's so meaningful. It's such a tangible thing that hits on people's lives.
But as a startup person, like when people said, well, government needs to think about services, I'm like, isn't that what they've always done? And I was amazed to find out that you actually have to sort of navigate the ministerial structure to get you have to carry the binder around from department to department, rather than saying, I'd like to move from one province to another and just have something and give you the services. This idea of service-centric government, I assumed it was there until I started digging.
Well, and I mean, I think what is interesting now is that actually you've got that service piece, but also you've got everything else that government does as well, and all those other interactions. So I think one of the things that Julia mentioned in your conversation, Julia Glidden, who's also of Microsoft, was some of the ways that other areas are using new technology. So we had this really interesting example of the Montreal Jewish Hospital using HoloLens during COVID to really amplify the reach of their specialist staff. So as they were getting overwhelmed by people, overwhelmed by patients, they needed a way to get those staff engaging with people across the whole range of the hospital, and also protecting them from being exposed to the virus as much as possible. So using HoloLens and this kind of remote assist technology, they were able to amplify the effectiveness of those surgeons in different places. And I think those types of applications of technology are super interesting as well, because they're outside of that, just that way we tend to be talking about, okay, how do you get benefits to people? How do you get better at tax collection? They're starting to get into what are the other things that we do as government where we can really start to push the boat and make ourselves more mature.
And I think people often forget that Microsoft is also, Minecraft and Skype and LinkedIn.
And there's super interesting stuff on Minecraft for education. I don't know if you've ever played with it at all, but it's ways of getting coding in the hands of kids through Minecraft is amazing.
The number of places that Microsoft is a part of day-to-day life, Xbox, whatever, is astonishing, right? HoloLens. And I think that that there's no doubt that we live in a world where digital is pervasive, and a lot of citizens are waiting for government to sort of catch up a bit. In the time we have left, if there's one thing that private sector Olivia could tell public sector Olivia, and if there's one thing that public sector Olivia could tell private sector Olivia, what would they be?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I think it's probably actually maybe the same thing. I think that the two have to trust each other more. I think that there is not, I was very suspicious of the private sector, frankly, before I moved to Microsoft. And I kind of did it as a learning experience for myself. I'm really glad I did. I know I would already be better public servant going back. I think that understanding between the sectors has to be built. We have to be more open to conversations with each other, because as we tackle those really big challenges of things like climate change, of things like government being trusted and relevant in a digital age, there's no way that we can do those things if we're not working together on them. So that trust and that cooperation has to come together.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your service on both sides of that aisle. But I know you've done amazing things in the private sector, and it's great to have someone that has that perspective working in the public sector now. So thanks a lot for being a believer in Forward 50 and for the work you're doing here. And yeah, looking forward to seeing where this goes next. And thank you again for supporting the conference. We had a blast meeting Julia and chatting with you and the workshops you ran, the PACT workshops. So really, really appreciate the way that you are trying to make digital government both more efficient and more effective.
Thanks, Alistair. Well, I hope to see you in Ottawa next fall.
Absolutely.